And of course, I'm going to interview myself, which I'm sure a lot of psychoanalysts would read a lot into, but I'm not going to. My chapter with Gert Biesta on thinking philosophically about education, thinking educationally about philosophy and educational research, although a very long titled chapter, I found quite challenging, not necessarily the first or former part of the title. It was more the second part of the title that I found really challenging. So thinking educationally about philosophy and educational research, for me, felt really kind of nonsensical, and it did until I actually started to engage with Gert Biesta more closely, particularly when we came to edit and write sections of the chapter together, the introduction and the conclusion I'm thinking of in particular. But the latter part of the title became a little bit more clear to me about Gert Biesta's perspective from a continental tradition. Challenges you to think more about what education can mean as opposed to it's just an application of philosophy in education. And so that, for me, I found not only challenging, but it also helped me come to a realisation that there's a little bit more to what's going on in that space, particularly within the continental tradition, and in particular the contribution the continental tradition can make to education. That would certainly be one thing that I took away from my chapter with Gert Biesta. Let's talk about Chapter 5 with Penny Enslin on liberal feminism, justice and education. One or two things that you would like to share with everyone about your collaboration with her.
So Penny Enslin is, in particular, uses a liberal feminism as her main theorist, but also integrates lots of different views. I think one thing that was interesting about speaking to Penny is liberal political philosophy has contributed a lot to philosophy of education, but it's not all that popular anymore. Like, you don't see a lot of research students using it. And she talked a bit about her concern about fads in terms of theory and as methodologies as well, so that liberalism it kind of went out of fashion a bit, I guess, because postmodernism became popular and emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism. And people assume that's incompatible with liberalism because it focuses on things like universal rights. And I think that's really problematic because liberalism has had so much to offer to education. And she talks about how liberalism is compatible with things like multiculturalism and diversity. In fact, people often use universal rights to defend minority cultures and their rights to express themselves and to access their culture. So, and I think she's probably the only person who really uses liberalism extensively in the book, so that's really a unique contribution. And she talks a lot about, how to use that theory to look at global issues in education today.
Maurice, thanks for coming in today. Appreciate you being here. Tell us a little bit about your collaboration with John Hattie in Chapter 6 here, titled here, John Hattie on Interpretation, the Story of Research and Necessity of Falsifiability. Tell us a little bit about John Hattie. He's been in the media a lot, particularly with education and teacher education, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who will have an interest in this chapter and what he has to say. So one or two things.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, John Hattie's quite famous as a psychometrician. I mean, someone who's in the business of using large data sets in order to investigate claims about what is effective in education in particular. So it's about analysis, collection of the data, analysis of the data, and interpretation of that data with the view of having some impact on education policy and practices, really making a difference. I think that was the clear message from John. He wants to do quantitative research in order to have some impact on the community. And part of his argument there is that it's not just about the data and it's not just about cranking the handle on quantitative work, but it's about developing an interpretation. And he feels that the interpretive aspect of the quantitative work is not as emphasised as much, that people are thinking that the data speaks for itself in some way. And that means that not only do you have to have an interpretation, but you also have to couch it as a story which would resonate or be attuned with the end users, if you like, the teaching community, that they have a sense of understanding whether it works or it doesn't. And that means that I think he couches his work in providing this interpretation and this story of research and having its impact in the sense of it being bold and courageous, that you put out that idea, that interpretation, and you let the community prove you wrong. And so I think one of the surprising aspects of his research, which people may not be familiar with, is this idea that he relies very heavily on the philosophy of Karl Popper, who said you're not there to confirm your ideas, but to set it up in such a way that they can be falsified, that you can take them down. And so I think that's something which people may find quite striking, is his kind of...
hence the title.
Yeah, his philosophical commitment to Karl Popper and his work. And so he encourages people to be courageous in their research and their interpretation and let others judge them harshly.
John, thanks for coming in to talk about your collaboration with Nel Noddings. So chapter 7 here, Nel Noddings on care theory and caring practice. A couple of insights from your collaboration with Nel Noddings.
Yeah, well, I think most people will be aware that Nel Noddings' work in care theory. So care theory, talking about theory, and is a contribution to this book that is about theory and philosophy and education research. And Nel's main contribution in relation to care theory is that it's a reciprocal act. So if I care for somebody, but that person isn't aware of that care, well, is that actually a caring interaction? And Nel would suggest that maybe it's not, or it isn't. And so that reciprocity, that interaction with care, so someone caring for and someone being cared for by, are important to that. And she situates that at the heart of education. So teacher, student, students, all those relationships need to be caring for them to work in education. But another aspect of the chapter that I found very interesting was the origins of her theoretical work. So, at the time when she was developing this theory, she was a mother and a mathematics teacher, and with an interest in being a philosopher of education. So care theory actually, for her, brought those three things together as a way of understanding how education works, through teaching, but also that parent, connection and parent responsibility, and the philosophy. So all those three together evolved into care theory.